I see the crisis in Greece as having an explanation that goes at three levels, or origins, if you will, that emerge at three levels. First, we have a global, the global, I call it, level, basically a very large debt bubble that we see throughout the Western world. We see it in Greece too. And the way to see this is to add, I think Zoltan indirectly alluded to this, to add the private debt to the public debt in OECD countries, let's say, and you see very large figures for all countries, in many cases, in most cases, higher totals than you do in Greece. What you do see is that in some countries like Greece, you have the public sector carrying more of the burden and of debt, and the private sector less so. Whereas in other countries like Spain, for instance, or Ireland, or the UK, or the US, it is or used to be the other way around. So the first part of the explanation that I will submit is that Greece fell, as many other countries, in the trap of a promise of prosperity. And since that promise of prosperity, widely echoed in the late 70s, early 80s, through a series of liberalization, deregulation experiments, and basically a new view on how to run the economy came to become prevalent in Europe, beginning in the UK, and even before that in the US, more globally. The delivering of that promise required the build-up of debt. In the case of Greece, for several reasons that I don't have time to go into, that went through the public sector conduit. In many other countries, and that applies to Portugal, by the way, and Italy too. In other countries like Spain, the UK, Ireland, it went through the private sector conduit. The second level of explanation is the European one. Greece had a deeper problem, had a more difficult problem to deal with because of belonging in the euro, sacrificing the exchange rate instrument and the monetary policy instrument. Now, it makes sense to do that when you have either the absence of asymmetric shocks, which is the fancy term for what Zoltan explained, that basically when shocks hit you, they hit everybody at the same time, or very high labor mobility, extremely high labor mobility we don't have in Europe, I don't think we ever will, or large transfers, which you do have from a large central budget. You do have in the case of the US, for instance. We don't have a large federal type central budget in Europe, so that is absent too. The hope I actually interviewed quite a few policymakers in the early 90s discussing the possibility of this happening for my PhD thesis at the time, and the response, surprisingly, was that they didn't think this would happen. And if it did, that the European Central Bank would take action to deal with the weakest link, with those countries that will be most in trouble. Actually, we saw that happening in a sense when France and Germany in the early 2000s had deficit issues to deal with, and the rules became more lax at the time to accommodate them. Anyway, that hope did not materialize in the case of Greece. Greece remained and faced the difficulties that it faced once the bubble burst on its own in many ways, without the monetary policy side kicking in to help the country along in 2008, 2009. The third level, of course, is the Greek level, and Greece had it and has had it more tougher than Portugal, for instance, or Ireland or Spain, because in many ways it had all of the elements for a perfect storm. Let me qualify a couple of the things, or a few things that were heard about the history of the Greek debt developing. Greece had very low debt levels until the mid-70s, mid to late 70s. They went up from the mid-teens, more or less, in the mid-70s to the upper 20s, low 30s, as a percent of GDP, by 1981, when Andreas Papandreou came to power. There was no welfare state in Greece, and there was very low debt levels. So the government at the time decided to create or boost whatever little there was of a welfare state while building up debt. So by the end of the 80s, that 34% of GDP debt level that they found had gone up to 68%. In the 3 years that followed, 4 years that followed, between 89 and 93, that debt level reached 100%, actually surpassed 100% of GDP. Interestingly enough, one of the best-known Greek economists of the second half, or throughout the 20th century, Xenophon Zolotas, that Zoltan mentioned, who was the chairman of the Greek Central Bank for a long, long time, was the technocrat that came to run the government, short-lived government we had in the in 89-90 in Greece, and he had to oversee this this further build-up of debt. Very strong efforts were taken in the 90s to stabilize Greek debt, and Greek debt was stabilized in the 90s to around 95-100% of GDP. That was the good news in a sense that allowed other countries to think that yes, Greek debt is high, but at the same time it is not high. It's in the same neighborhood as Belgian debt and its Italian debt. High but steady in a sense. Things became, and there I may disagree with Zoltan a little bit, became substantially worse in the decade after entering the euro, largely because, unlike in the 90s, where the fat cow years, Europe-wide fat cow years, were used to stabilize, actually reduce debt, this was not done in the 2000s, in the first decade of this century. I submit, that's my explanation, that the good economist, actually very good economist, academic economist too, who was in charge of the Ministry of Finance in Greece for those years, for the Conservative Party that was in power, the reason why he didn't do what his predecessors did in the 90s was that he actually bought the Greenspan rhetoric. He bought the Goldilocks economy image and the projection of a soft landing. So there was very little done between 2004 and 2008, again, the good years, when, a tide that lifts all boats, the measures that were taken in the 90s, in the similarly good period, the second half of the 90s, were not replicated at that time. So when the crisis hit, Greece was much weaker, was the weak link in many ways in the Eurozone area. And the measures taken were too little, too late on the Greek side. So that, if you will, is the three levels of explanation as to what happened in Greece. As to what has happened since and where we have been since, Zoltan mentioned something that is very important, but he didn't have time, I guess, to go into a little bit more detail. I will, because I think it is important. Greece is not and has not been spending too much in terms of social spending, and he debunked a few of the myths about the Greek non-existent or welfare state, the pension system, and all that. The important thing that he underlined, that there is a big revenue problem in Greece, and he did well to underline this. However, the extra step we need to take to understand this, why this is the case, is to identify as the cause of this, the fact, the structural issue in the Greek economy, that Greece is the economy, the country that has by far the highest percentage of self-employed people in Europe. If you actually compare by category, the self-employed part of the German economy evades taxes just about as much as the Greek part, of the self-employed part of the Greek economy. The problem is that in Greece you have many, many more self-employed than you do in countries like Germany, or Finland for that matter, or Holland for that matter. Often the issue is presented as the Greeks, a democracy issue. Greeks voting and they want this to happen. What you get when you say this is the other side, German policymakers, Dutch policymakers, saying, look, you vote for this, we vote not to allow more money to be given. So why is your democratic decision more weighty than our democratic decision? I think this is the wrong way to see this. The way to see this is to do like the IMF does and use medical analogies. You have a patient, doctors are imposing or, prescribing a sequence of therapies, and they're not working. The patient should have the right at some point to say, look, what you are applying does not work. We should try something else. If you will, to take a specific condition, I'm overweight, I may need to lose weight to become faster, more competitive, but the sort of diet you're imposing on me may end up producing, because of liver failures that it may cause at the same time, may end up producing a very beautiful corpse. And you don't want that to happen. So I'll stop here.